everyone, I'm Cleo from Winchester Skeptics, and welcome to tonight's Skeptics in the Pub online. We've got another excellent talk lined up for you. Tonight, I'm really excited to be able to fulfill the fantasies of a whole load of skeptics and introduce a show all about dogs. Jessica Pierce is a bioethicist with the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical School. Her work focuses on human-animal relationships and the interconnections between ecosystems and health. Her most recent books include Who's a Good Dog and How to Be a Better Human. Marc Bekoff is Professor Emeritus of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Colorado, Boulder. He's received numerous awards for his work on animal protection, too many to recite here, and he served on the boards of a number of organisations in the field. For example, he and Jane Goodall co-founded Ethologists for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, Citizens for Responsible Animal Behaviour Studies, in 2000. His books include Dogs Demystified, an A to Z guide to all things canine. So we'll be putting links to their books in the Twitch chat. Tonight, Jessica and Marc are going to talk to us about how dogs might survive, even thrive, in a post-human world. They explore this subject in detail in their new book, with the same title as tonight's talk, A Dog's World, Imagining the Lives of Dogs in a World Without Humans. So, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, this is a little change because Jessica usually starts, but she's frozen up in the mountains somewhere. There's no direct line into how we came to write this book. We wrote a book called The Animal's Agenda about compassion in the age of humans, and then we wrote a book called Unleashing Your Dog. And then while we were discussing new ideas, because we love writing together, it just came out. I mean, we can't say whose idea it was, but we are both very interested in human dog and human non-human animal relationships. And it just came out, well, what would the world be like for dogs if we weren't here? And, some of it was motivated by people's self-inflated, self-centered views. When we asked them, what would happen if humans disappeared? Oh, my dog would never live without me, for example. They could never survive, without me. And then we realized that there really were no simple answers. And this is all very early on while we were talking about the book, before we even wrote up a proposal. But we asked a lot of people, and like I said, the responses were, my dog couldn't live without me. Some people just said, well, they'd be better off without us. Some people looked to Chernobyl and said, well, we can look there because of the the nuclear disaster there. But the fact of the matter is, and it's among some of the facts that we really discovered as we researched and wrote the book, was that Chernobyl isn't a good example. I mean, the nuclear plant exploded or imploded, but the dogs who remained were given good care by people who remained up there, in the area. So these were free-ranging dogs, but not, if you will, homed dogs. So some of the things that we began with in the book were looking at the diverse nature of dogs. Dogs are really the most diverse mammal known, and of course that happened because of human selection and artificial selection. So we basically manufactured dogs in, if you will, in our image. Large dogs, Great Danes, small dogs, Chihuahuas, different breeds of dogs where they can't breed or give birth on their own, and they can't breathe. So dogs are extremely diverse. And that made us really think a lot about whether there were any simple answers. So I'm just going to run through a few variables here because I think it's really fascinating, and a few facts. So all dogs came from a common wolf ancestor. So current dogs, despite our interference in their breeding and how they would raise, if you will, their children, have wolf DNA and wolf genes in them. and they still have, if you will, wolf engrams in their brains. They still have a lot going on in their brains that really guide and can direct their behavior. They come in all different shapes and sizes. So some people say, well, only large dogs would make it, and or small dogs would fall prey to non-human competitors. Well, it really turns out that what we learned was that size was not really all that important. In some habitats, in some places, large dogs would do very well. In some places, small dogs might do very well. Small dogs would not be, they wouldn't really form tight relationships, say, with other members of carnivore communities in which dogs found themselves. They could run faster and hide and get away from them. Large animals or large dogs might form, they might learn to coexist, cooperate, or compete with other members in the wild communities in which they found themselves. So size wouldn't be very important. In terms of breeding, the two major variables that would be important to consider would be sex and food. Dogs can hybridize and produce viable offspring with wolves and coyotes and jackals. So they might form mating partnerships with these animals and produce viable offspring. In terms of food habits, well, dogs can hunt. I mean, I've lived in the mountains for a long time, and they can hunt. And I had a grad student who actually studied feral dogs, and they form packs that really resemble and function like wolf packs. So getting food, once again, might be difficult. They never had real practice doing it, but they could survive and get the meals they need. In terms of sociality and forming social groups, they might live on their own, they might live as a pair or a mated pair, and they may live as an organized pack, just as do coyotes and wolves. So there should be really no problem there. In terms of their inner lives and their cognitive capacities for dealing with unknown or unexpected situations, they would do very well. We already know that from lab studies of dogs, and we already know that from the behavior and lives of free-ranging dogs who have been studied in different locales. And dogs are highly emotional beings, and they would definitely have the emotional intelligence to form long-lasting and tight bonds, either with other dogs who they would meet, or with the wild carnivores. So people really need to remember that dogs have all the physical, cognitive, and emotional capacities to live on their own or to form close relationships with other animals. So the bottom line for Jessica and I were that some dogs would make it, some dogs wouldn't. Dogs, in the first generation, when we would disappear, would be dogs who were existing. So the prediction might be that free-ranging and feral dogs might do better than homed dogs who have cushy lives. But we really don't know that. So what really took me about this program, and I'm always a fan of skeptics, that is that the skepticism with which a lot of people came to this project and said, no, dogs wouldn't live without us, was clearly misleading. So that's basically, that's basically why we wrote the book and what we found. And I see Jessica's back, so I'll turn it over to her.
My apologies for being late, and I don't know exactly what Mark has talked about and not. So I think what I'll do is just scrap my original plan and jump in with some conversation about why this book was interesting to me as an ethicist. I think it's obvious why it's interesting to a biologist or ethologist, but it was, there were a number of things about it that were really intriguing to me in my thinking about how humans live in relationship to dogs. And, you know, one of the things that happened as we were writing this book is that we kept a kind of running tally of things that dogs had to gain by humans disappearing and things that dogs had to lose by humans disappearing. And, you know, for example, some of the things in the gains column, what would dogs gain if humans went away, are, you know, the ability to actually live freely on their own, to make choices about who they want to interact with, under what conditions, what they want to eat, when they want to eat it, who they want to have, who they want to choose as mates, and wouldn't be forced into, you know, puppy mills and really kind of exploitive relationships that humans sometimes form with dogs. And then, you know, on the losses side, you know, they would lose a ready source of food for sure, and human companionship, which, you know, so that's a kind of a mixed bag there, but definitely some things that dogs would lose in that realm. Ultimately, the gains column turned out to be a lot longer than the losses column, which was kind of eye-opening for me. Like, wow, are humans really so bad in their treatment of dogs that dogs would be better off without us? And of course, that raises the ethical question. Well, if that's really the case, then are there things we can be doing now to kind of even out the columns and take some of those potential gains away and add to the losses that dogs might experience if we were no longer here? And so there was that. And then one of the other things that we thought about in relation to future post-human dogs is, you know, if we knew that humans were going to disappear and there were going to be a future for dogs without us, would there be things that we should be doing to, as you might say, doomsday prepping for dogs? You know, not just doomsday prepping for us and our dogs by stockpiling enormous quantities of dog food, which might not be a bad idea, but really thinking about breeding and engaging with dogs in ways that don't make them less likely to survive in the future, but actually more likely to survive. And so thinking about traits that might make it difficult for them. And, you know, one thing that comes to mind for me, and I did an interview recently with a reporter for Vox, and he wrote a really interesting article on how dogs fare in extreme heat. And one of the things that comes up over and over in this conversation about dogs and heat is that certain breeds of dog have a more difficult time adapting to extreme heat. And the category of dog that jumps to mind is the brachycephalic dogs, the dogs with really short snouts, like the pugs and the boxers, who notoriously have a really difficult time when it's hot out, and, you know, have to be really constrained in how much exercise they get. And so if we're looking at a future without us, should we be breeding dogs who are going to be as robust and well adapted as possible, and try to, you know, stop breeding for aesthetic traits that we find charming or cute, but really focusing on what dogs need themselves? So maybe, you know, in an ideal 20 years or 30 years, there would be no dogs with extremely foreshortened snouts, because they're going to have a really hard time surviving without us, and they also have a hard time surviving with us. So thinking about dogs of the future kind of aligns us with some things that might be good for dogs, even if we are still here. And then, you know, I think one of the most important takeaways from this imaginary project is that, you know, there are a lot of ways in which we ask dogs not to really be dogs. And if you think about the way in which we approach training, for example, you know, a lot of training focuses on what Mark and I both have called de-dogging, or, you know, trying to kind of take the dog behaviors out of the dog because we find them annoying. So trying to, you know, get dogs to stop barking, get dogs to stop roaming, and get dogs to stop pulling on the leash toward things that smell good, and not rolling in dead stuff. And I'm sorry I don't have my slides up, because I had all kinds of slides of dogs doing fun stuff here, like rolling in dead stuff and sniffing each other's butts. But I think we put a lot of effort into taking the dog out of the dog. And there are a number of ways in which we can put the dog back in the dog, and be more accepting of and altering our expectations of dogs in such a way that they align with who dogs actually are and who they need to be and want to be, so that we don't see them as these domesticated playthings or objects for consumption, but really as real animals. And one of the things that we really tried to do in the book that I found fascinating, and I think is also valuable for people who live with dogs, who share their life with a dog, is looking at how the 80% of the dogs who don't live as pets make their way in the world, and how they behave. Like, maybe those are more representative of dog-like behavior than the dog sitting next to us on the couch. One of the things about the slides that I tried to include was some images, most of them that were shared with us by Marco Atta, who does research on free-roaming dogs in Bali. So I'll run through these really quickly, most of them because we're well past them. But I also wanted to introduce the main collaborator on my end. This is Bella, my dog. And yeah, my opening salvo in this talk was how often we who live with dogs might find ourselves sort of chuckling and gently chiding them about how they couldn't possibly survive without us. And I had a dog named Maya. This is not actually Maya, but I had a dog named Maya who just really did not like putting her feet into puddles. It was really funny. She was very meticulous about her paws. You know, dogs who try as hard as they can to catch squirrels, but really don't do a very effective job. And then dogs who, you know, say, where are my hiking booties? My feet hurt. So, okay, I'm going to skip ahead now through, I think Mark talked about a lot of these things. Our two main questions in the book: would dogs survive, and what might happen to them? Talk about feeding related behaviors. I'm gonna just skip ahead here to that. This is my grand dog Poppy. We included Poppy in the book because we thought that she was an example of one possible future morphology for dogs, which would be like all dogs kind of end up being middle-sized and one color. And you know, Poppy's she's about as mixed a mixed breed as you can get. So when dogs start to really get to breed on their own. There's our gains and losses. You can see the gains column is longer. Oh, this slide I thought was amusing because it was from the American Kennel Club's Responsible Dog Ownership Day celebration. And it's kind of, in my mind, the anti-dog. Like, one of the things that dogs will gain when we go away is they won't have to have their fur turned rainbow colors anymore. And some images just of dogs getting to be dogs and do dog stuff. You know, a lot of homed dogs don't get nearly as much time sniffing as they want to. And we get really hung up on dogs sniffing each other's butts. But for them, that's a really important site of information. And there's really no reason we need to impose our moral prudishness on them. And this slide I had as an example of how looking at free-ranging dogs can just give us pause about how we keep pet dogs. People who do research on free-ranging dogs have done some studies on how they use space, which is you know, it's one of the things that biologists will look at in studying various species of animal. You know, how do they arrange themselves within a territory? How much space do they typically use as a home range? And they found a huge variety in free-ranging dogs. Some had a home range that was quite small, of about half an acre, and some had a home range that was as large as 7,000 acres, which is really kind of mind-boggling when you think about it, and when you think about how much, you know, if you hear about a pet dog who has a half-acre backyard, you think, wow, that is a really lucky dog. So finding ways to give them more access to space, I think, is a good thing to do for them. And you know, I think it's hard to imagine a world without us in it, because we would no longer be here with our dogs. But I think it's really helpful and healthy for us to imagine that our dogs would survive without us, because it helps us, I think, decenter ourselves a little bit. And I think our tendency is to be kind of human-centered in our thinking about dogs. And when we decenter the human, then we can really think about who dogs are as themselves, as their own unique beings. And I think it can give us some fresh insight into how we can form relationships with them and live in ways with them that benefit both of us. And you know, I think we can ask our dogs kind of jokingly, what would you ever do without me? I say that to Bella, and then I also say, what would I ever do without you? I think they might indulge us with a smile, sniff, be an extra close sniff and a gaze, and just say, I imagine all kinds of dog possibilities. And I know we have already welcomed Mark. So now I guess I will welcome all of you to engage in some conversation with us about this speculative experiment. Unless, Mark, do you have anything more you want to add that I haven't touched on?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the important things that Jessica touched on is how dogs express their dogness. And I think a really important thing to remember, we need to really get out. Jessica mentioned it. We really need to get out and study free-ranging dog, because such a large percentage of dogs in the world live on their own. They may get human assistance, but they may be feral, totally on their own, like one of my populations that one of my students studied. And so people are drawing conclusions about who dogs are and what they can do, what they know, and what they feel from handful of lab studies of a handful of dogs. I want to stress that this doesn't mean the research is poor. It really means that people say, well, dogs, I've never seen a dog do something. And I'll go, gosh, I was at the dog park or out with free-ranging dogs and I saw it 100 times. And I think that one of the messages for me as a field biologist that came out of writing the book and spending a lot of time with free-ranging dogs is that we shouldn't be using home dogs or lab dogs or dogs that come into labs, if you will, from home as the template for how dogs behave and what they need to do to express their dogness. And I stress that because I feel that a lot of dogs would do really well without us. And like I said, in the first generation, people who, dogs who have lived on their own. So Marco Atta and I and a number of other field workers have really been stressing that people stop. They can't say, well, so-and-so found that dogs don't do something because they do them every day. Do dogs have a theory of mind? Can they read the mind and behavior of other animals, say of other dogs? Yeah, they can. Although it's not been shown in the lab, it doesn't mean anything to me as a field worker for people to conclude that, for example, they don't have a theory of mind. And I think that's a really, for the future, while we're around, when we're not here, we won't be able to do the studies, which might be just fine. But while we're here, we shouldn't be saying that dogs can't do this or can't do that, because it's just not true.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I mean, I really enjoyed hearing the idea that while some of our pampered poochers might find it a little bit tough, on the whole, dogs might do absolutely fine without. So I'll say thank you again and just tell everybody, remember to head on over to sitp.online/ask to ask your questions of our speakers and upvote the ones you want most. And we will see you in about 15 minutes. Welcome back. I imagine you've all been having really interesting conversations about dogs and how they'd be without us. So, and we've got some really interesting questions here, so we'll jump straight in. First question then is from Parrot Lady, who asks, she says, legal wolf hybrids seem slightly different from other dogs. Would they theoretically have an advantage?
You want me to start with that?
You can start. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, I lived with wolf dog hybrids and I lived with coyote dog hybrids, and I've seen a couple of coyote dog hybrids in the field. Yeah, it's hard to know. They might have an advantage, but not necessarily because of the DNA and the wolfy brains that domestic dogs still have. It could be a size advantage, but I don't think so. A priori, I would be skeptical of thinking that they might have an advantage over other dogs. It's possible that mutts might have an advantage over purebreds, but you have to remember that come the second generation after we're not here, there might be a golden retriever breeding with a golden retriever just by circumstance, but there'll probably be a lot of mutts around, mixed breeds, if you will. And there's this phenomenon in genetics called heterosis. It's called hybrid vigor. So, and once again, we don't know whether they would be better off. So it's a really good question. And there might be problems too with parenting the hybrids, because once again, we know already now from some work that it may not be so clear cut that the offspring of a wolf and a dog or a coyote and a dog, in the wild would receive good parenting. Or adequate parenting. We just don't know.
There was, in your book, you suggested that the in a couple of generations' time, there would be more wolf dog hybrids or coyote dog hybrids. From the ones you've seen, were they more doggy or more wolfy?
It depends on the dog, and it depends how they're reared. That was part of my thesis decades ago. Some of the coyote dog hybrids retained a few unique behaviors that are unique to coyotes, but there's no evidence at all that they would be important for adaptation and survival in the wild. I mean, it's a great question, but there was just no evidence that those behavior patterns that were evident would have anything. They wouldn't be necessarily detrimental, but they wouldn't necessarily be beneficial. Yeah.
And
it's a great question.
I'm not sure the next is it's sort of ethics, sort of biology, actually. It's Igor asks, what are some terrible practices that we're still doing to our dogs that we should immediately stop?
Well, do you want me to start on that and then you can jump in?
But you don't have 24 hours.
I mean, I think that forcing dogs to breed in puppy mills and even in nice commercial breeding facilities is exploitative. Breeding dogs for traits that cause them lifelong suffering or disability, I think is a practice that could and should stop immediately. And any features that are very extreme, like extreme. One of the trends that I find really disturbing at the moment is a trend toward miniaturization of dogs. So people wanting not just a Chihuahua or a Maltipoo, but a mini Chihuahua or teacup or hand size Chihuahua or Maltipoo. And the further you push an animal to the extremes of its morphology, the more likely the animal is going to have genetic problems, health problems, and so forth. So that's another one. As Mark said, I could probably go on for 24 hours. Those are two that jump out. I mean, punitive training practices are something that are really unnecessary and could and should stop immediately. Mark, what would you add?
Yeah, I mean, I would add, I would agree with Jessica on all of them. The other is just people are such control freaks, telling them when they can pee, poop, eat, what they're going to eat, who they're going to play with, when they're going to play with them. And, just letting dogs do what I've just was writing, dog appropriate behaviors. Dogs need to chew. It's a common, important behavior in all wild carnivores. So the reason they chew on socks isn't to piss a person off. It's they need to chew, and simple like that. I was walking to a meeting a few days ago, and a dog jumped on my leg and started humping me. And the woman got really upset. And I said, well, I don't really care, to be honest with you. And she was telling me that the dog is a humper, really, and dogs can be. And he jumped on somebody. It was a male dog, but females do it too. And the guy wanted to immediately call the police and have the dog taken away. I mean, this is a true story. It just happened right outside my place. And he arrested the woman, which of course was the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. But the fact of the matter is, dogs do these things. They like to sniff butts and groins and hump. I can understand why people don't want their leg mounted. I don't really care. But these are natural behaviors. So I know Jessica's written a lot about it. Just given the opportunity and the context in which they can hump and which they can be dogs. I mean, people think that humping is all sexual. Wild coyotes, wild wolves, wild foxes, with whom I've spent countless hours, they do it to one another. It could be fun. It could be part of play. It's not necessarily dominance, but it could be. But I think the overall control freak, I spend so much time at dog parks, and people go, okay, we're only here for 5 minutes before I go get my Starbucks. And dogs like looking at the people thinking, what's going on here? So less control. That would, more choice, more agency, consent. Let the dogs tell you whether they agree with you on what you ask of them, and context, understanding that what dogs do what they do and why they do it varies from context to context.
Yeah, one of my sorry, one of my granddogs, a large, she's a half Newfoundland. Her favourite thing when we're at home doing nothing much in the evening is humping her bed.
Mhm.
Is there a reason why she picks her bed? Is that's her favourite thing?
I can't think of any reason. She likes to do it.
Why not? It must feel good or be a place that is associated with comfort
Hmm.
or arousal. I'm not necessarily sexual arousal, just
Yeah.
arousal.
No, I mean, what Jessica's saying is so true. They just do it. It might be fun. If it wasn't bringing them some enjoyment, and once again, I don't mean sexual gratification, they wouldn't do it. So my dog, I had a baby coyote once. We had rescued them, who liked humping a beach ball. Who cares? No, but I mean, who cares? Do they do it in the wild? Yeah, in the thousands of hours I've watched wild coyotes, you will see adults as well, but mostly youngsters. They'll jump on something and the whole sexual repertoire is released. Big deal. They're not perverts. People would go, oh, they're just such perverts. And I'm going, really? Why would you say that? So I get right back to the phrase dog appropriate behaviors, and those are dog appropriate behaviors.
So while there's big things, I mean, horrible things that we would want to stop happening to dogs immediately, there's also little things that we can do at home as well, like letting them be dogs.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And providing
Yeah.
things for them that they can chew if we don't want them to chew our socks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although
Yeah,
it is
yeah.
socks, isn't it? Why is it always socks that they come back to you with in their mouths? Is it
Some
Smell.
smell. Maybe it feels good too. That the texture
Yeah,
and that there's nothing
yeah,
better to use right at
yeah.
hand.
Do I admit here that dogs, they seem to more than anything else love going in my gym bag and taking out my knee sleeve. That seems to be a favourite.
Yeah, I don't know that I could understand why they go to certain objects, but it could be texture, it could be odor, it could be because it's there.
Mm.
You know what I mean? So it might be a sneaker, it might be a jacket. Um, and I think they might have preferences too, because I've had dogs, and maybe Jessica has, and you all, who really like the texture of tennis balls. So they'd have these rotten tennis balls. They're ripping the coat off it. They stink like hell, and they run around, and they're proud. It's not that they're being proud of it. It feels good on their gums. And Paul McGreevy, who's an Australian veterinarian, as well as an expert dog ethologist, when he was in Boulder last year, when I was writing my book, Dogs Demystified, he said, "Do you have a section on chewing?" And I said, I had one sentence. When I got done having dinner with him, I had a couple of paragraphs, because one of his specialties is chewing. And I went back and looked at some films. I went back and talked to some of the field workers, and they said, well, yeah, these animals are chewing all the time. They really are. They're chewing on bones, they're chewing on sticks, they're chewing on objects. I mean, they could be chewing. I had a baby coyote who chewed on rocks. It just felt good.
I've read that they shouldn't be allowed to chew on sticks, but they do it all the time. Is there something behind that?
They could choke on it.
Right.
Yeah.
So should we be trying to stop it?
I think
Yeah,
I think there's always a balance in letting dogs engage their natural behaviors with safety. And chewing is one example where,
absolutely.
and there are a lot of, there's disagreement about what constitutes a safe chewing toy or object for dogs. And, we could spend 24 hours just talking about different opinions about whether dogs should chew on rawhide or whether they should be allowed to chew on bones and whether they should chew on sticks and whether they should chew on antlers. And I think everybody has to make a determination about, what they're comfortable with. But yeah, I think there's concern about them breaking their teeth or ingesting pieces of stick. And, one thing about tennis balls I discovered, because Bella, who you saw a picture of with a ball in her mouth, is obsessed with balls. She loves chasing balls. And her favorite thing about chasing is not actually chasing, it's just mouthing the ball. So she'll get a ball. She just swims now because has some trouble with her back legs, but she'll swim for the ball and then come to shore and spend about 5 minutes just mouthing the ball, chewing on it. And there are other situations in which we kind of have to do the balancing of safety versus giving our dogs what they need and letting them be dogs, like off leash time, and balancing keeping dogs safe from roads and safe from humping other people's legs and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, somebody asked me once, do we know how many, say, wild coyotes or wild wolves or foxes choke on something, and maybe even die? No, we don't. But they also have much stronger jaw musculature and can break things up. And years ago, we had a rescued wolf where I was studying, and the wolf died of swallowing a chicken neck, choked to death. And somebody said, well, that's because they were in captivity and domesticated. And that was the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. They weren't domesticated. It was a wild wolf who had been, a young wolf who had been abandoned, And so no, I don't know. But it's possible that they can chew things up finer. But Jessica's right. I mean, it's our obligation to give them safety. Marrow bones sometimes work, but when they get really fragile, I mean, I've yanked a piece of bone out of the throat of some of my dogs over the years. Would they have choked? I don't know. But when they're gagging and it seems like they can't breathe, that's what you do. But in the wild, we don't know how often that happens. But yeah.
That actually leads nicely into the next question from Vic, who asks, is there any difference in the life expectancy of pet dogs, specifically dogs, pet dogs compared to free-ranging dogs?
No one knows.
I would say there appears to be some, well, yeah, it depends. I guess it's complicated and it depends. Didn't we talk a little bit about mortality rates, Mark? I mean, I think mortality rates among free-ranging dogs tend to be relatively high, but the greatest threat to free-ranging dogs is humans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, if in a future scenario, things would be different, and I mean, life expectancy, it would even out. And pet dogs, I think there's a lot of variability there too, because dogs who are bred with, like, brachycephalic breeds tend to have shorter lifespans on average, maybe 6 to 8 years, as opposed to other, like, medium-sized breeds or mixed breeds who might live 12 to 14. So.
Right. I mean, those dogs the dogs who can't breathe or exercise or give birth or copulate and make more of themselves are done. I mean, it's simple as that. But it is a good question. But I mean, your average coyote wolf might live to 6 to 8 years. There might be early mortality for any number of reasons. And there might be animals who live longer. And those are the things with which dogs are going to be confronted, especially, second in generation and down the line when we're no longer here. I mean, I would love to be the ethologist or the fly on the wall who could be around to see what really happens.
You'll be the one posthuman human.
Yes. I might get lonely and there'll be nobody to talk to about what we find.
You wouldn't be lonely because you would have so many dogs.
Right. Right. And I would miss some people, but certainly a lot who would be fine. Anyway, I'm not going there. That's just another topic. But it's a good question because of diet too. They would not be forced to eat all the crap that comes off of the shelf. My dog survived in the mountains, rarely being leashed, rarely being collared, eating a lot of peanut butter bagels and rice and bean burritos. That's another thing Jessica and I talk about in the book about, the supposed quote people food, human food, and dog food, right? I mean, and the reason I'm saying that is that, in some ways, the dogs who go on to survive and survive long enough and thrive so that they could form relationships and make more children, might have just healthier diets overall. I mean, free ranging and feral dogs do very well diet wise.
Can I come in there then with sticking, because you've mentioned diet, someone actually asked a question about diet. Have dogs evolved their digestion, etc., in the same way as humans? So Katie asks, not that they couldn't hunt and survive, but would they have a disadvantage compared to wolves? So as we domesticated ourselves, our diets changed. Has the same happened to dogs, or could they still survive on the ancestral diet?
Yeah. I can
say
take a
something.
stab first.
Good question.
I mean, dogs have, it's an interesting question. Dogs have evolved in their diet in interesting ways in relationship to humans. That is to say, dogs, because of their close association with humans, have certain dietary adaptations that are not present in wolves, for example. And one that comes to mind is the ability to digest starch or starch. So dogs can eat and do well on pasta, whereas a wolf might not feel so good. And whether that adaptation would be useful in the future when there is no pasta is really hard to say. Maybe it would just kind of disappear over time, or maybe it would allow dogs on their own to eat some different things and get more nutrients from. Maybe they'll eat tubers. I don't know. But it's a really interesting question, impossible to answer, but interesting. What would you want to add, Mark?
Yeah, well, I mean, the feral dogs that have been studied and the ones that my student studied years ago did well. They can hunt, catch mice. They can live off of carcasses that are not necessarily rotting, if you will. But like Jessica said, it is a fascinating question. But they might adapt really fast. I mean, one of the limitations, we didn't really write about it, but I mentioned it before, would be the strength of the masseter muscles. So wolves have this sagittal crest on their head where the jaw muscles insert. So the wolf bite is significantly stronger per square inch than even a big dog's bite. So, but there's no reason. I was talking to an anatomist about it, who knows about dental structure and skeletal structure. And he just said, there's really no reason why the dogs themselves, it's not going to be passed on in a Lamarckian way. Like I play the piano so my kids can, or I have a bigger muscle so my kids will. But over time, there'll be selection for it. But there's also going to be plenty of food out there. Small rodents. I mean, wolves like elk and deer and moose, but they'll also eat rabbits and squirrels and, other animals. So I think that I don't think your average dog on their own, say one or more generations out, will have problems getting food.
You made me think. Do you think then that dogs like sighthounds and terriers will do better for food catching?
I don't know. I mean, I mean, it's a great question because of the unique senses. Bloodhounds have the amazing, nose and their ears that flap to get their odors going. Dogs are really adaptable. We don't see that because of the large percentage of dogs with whom people are familiar live in homes where they have crappy and some have but they have very limited lives. But I mean, when I've seen free ranging dogs in China, East Africa, and India. They did pretty well. They did pretty well. The one thing that they were missing, but it didn't necessarily have an effect on longevity was they weren't getting vet care. But in Italy, there's this group who's been studying dogs around the Rome airport. I met the dogs. I know the people. There's a woman who every morning brought out a big pot of chicken soup. I mean, these dogs are in heaven, right? I mean, it's kind of like, room service at a hotel. But the point is, she won't be around if you disappear. Although she was a lovely woman, and if anyone was going to survive, it would be nice to have somebody like her. But dogs have amazing diversity, and they are amazingly adaptable when they need to be. One example Jessica's written about is how well, if you will, they adapt. Maybe psychologically they're screwed up. How well they adapt to really confined and regular schedules bore the hell out of them. I mean, they just take it.
I'll ask on to the next question. So there's so many really fascinating questions here. Linda later says she asks about the difference between male and female dogs. Would free-range females have a worse time than males because of puppy rearing responsibilities? And I know you said loads about this in your book.
I mean, my answer to that, I mean, aside from the typical, it depends on the individual, I would say yes, probably so, because the energy requirements of feeding yourself and also another being, both during pregnancy and then during puppy rearing, is significant. So females are going to have to find more food more effectively, and just are going to have greater caloric needs. And one of the things that's really unknown but fascinating to think about is whether male dogs are going to help. Are they going to be engaged in parental behavior? Are they going to help with feeding? If they did, it might offset the difficulties that female dogs will face. It would improve everybody's survival.
Yeah, I think they will, though, because remember there was that study in helping behavior by adults other than the mother, well, even the father, but having aunts and uncles or other older siblings is called alloparental behavior, and it was observed in India. And Tom, who was my student, observed it in feral dogs. Nobody's really studied it enough to know, how prevalent it will be. But once again, coyotes show this alloparental behavior. Wolves show the alloparental behavior. There's no reason to think that dogs won't adapt into that situation. But yeah, a pregnant female who then gives birth and lactates might have more trouble than a male who, there's no evidence that males are going to become pregnant in the future, although that would be another interesting scientific discussion. But it's a great question. My feeling is there's enough plasticity in the behavior that a lot of males will be good fathers. We don't even know about how, we do know, but we don't even know how good a mother a lot of female dogs would be, because breeders rip, in puppy mills, which are disgusting hellholes, take the puppies away from the mothers, But I do think that there's enough evidence from wild coyotes and wild wolves that the fathers will be good. The fathers will be good fathers, and Rick McIntyre's actually seen that in Yellowstone.
I'd like to think that. It's nice to think that they would recover an old behaviour, isn't it, that they'd lost? Yeah. The next.
It's a great biological question. I think they will down the line, because it's still in their genes, if you will. But we don't know.
So the next question is really interesting as well, from Pine Snake, and I hope this is going to lead on to a different kind of discussion. But what they actually ask is, are there any ethical reasons for clipping the ears of dogs or docking their tails?
No, but I'll let Jessica go on to that.
No,
that's her
I think there's no good ethical or practical reason to do either of those surgeries, and they're harmful to dogs. They're really for human aesthetic preference. And I lived with a dog for 15 years who had a cropped tail. So I've thought a lot about the taillessness of, well, he had a part of a tail, but it took away from his ability to communicate. Instead of just wagging his tail, he had to wag his entire body, which he did fine. He liked to do that, but I, you hear that explanations like, they crop tails so that hunting dogs don't get their tails caught in the brush, which I don't find a compelling explanation personally. So I would put that on the list of things that we could and should stop doing immediately to dogs, because it reduces their ability to communicate with each other, and it's also painful and invasive.
How much they use their tails? I mean, we know we read their tails, but how much they use their tails for communicating with each other?
A ton.
A lot.
Yeah, they use them a ton for communicating. For example, how they feel. I mean, just the posture of a tail, whether it's stiff or relaxed. And so a dog without a tail is really at a disadvantage in communications.
I can't remember if it was this book or Unleashing, but I have personal. I have some stories from friends, but one was a situation where a dog's tail got run over by a car and they had to amputate it, and the dog angel just did well. She learned to adapt without it. I mean, so it's a great question. So there are tailless dogs, dogs who are born without tails. But I mean, doing stuff to the ears and their tail dismembering is just disgusting. I mean, it's done for aesthetic reasons, so Jessica probably knows more about this than I do, but I talked to vets about it, and there are some vets who just won't do it. They're not going to declaw cats, and they're not going to cut tails and make, what do you call them? Crop? No, what do you make it when the ears go up?
Pricked ears.
Like on Dobermans, for example. Yeah, I mean, why do it?
So thinking of ears, and I have grand dogs. I've got a grand dog who's a cross, but his ears do this. They're either flopping there or they are. He's a Saluki cross, and his ears are all over the place. And other dogs just have long floppy ears. Is there any advantage or disadvantage? Which will survive? Which will our new dog have?
We talked about that some in the book, and ultimately it's hard to say for sure, but our hypothesis was that floppy ears might be a disadvantage because the hearing would be slightly less acute, and the communicative capacities of the ears are slightly reduced when they're long and floppy. So perhaps in a post-human future that the trait of floppy ears will over time disappear.
I mean, and that's a fascinating thought experiment, for the future, and it might be that that the more erect ears that they could rotate might be better for communicating among themselves and other, wolves and coyotes with whom they might breed, for example. But I don't know. It's just so hard to tell because their phenotypes, what they look like, there'll be a lot of adaptation, natural selection, if you will. So maybe floppy-eared dogs would do well in one environment, but the point is, that a lot of these dogs will be hybrids too, mutts. And so who knows? I mean, I had I've seen dogs one ear up and one ear down. So somebody said, would they do better because they have um, more choices, if you will, of how to? Yeah, who knows? These are great. I mean, these are great questions, and there could. I don't know if there's enough for another book here, but they're really great questions because as a biologist, they talk about all the different types of natural selection there are. There's what we call stabilizing selection. So have an average phenotype that does the best, and then you've got um, directional selection, which is away from the mean. So it might be in some habitats there's selection for small dogs, in others, big dogs. So your mean sized dog is actually at a disadvantage, you know, and or no, direction would be only large or only small dogs do well. And diversifying selection would be small dogs and large dogs do better. Dogs with floppy ears or one of each do better. But and I've talked to some really good evolutionary biologists about it who had first said, well, it's an interesting thought experiment. But I said, but let's apply the different types of natural selection because people forget that natural selection is going to replace artificial selection. We're not going to be around to produce dogs who, I don't mean we, but humans in general, who we find attractive. So what are they, who are they going to look like? And I think from some of the free-ranging dog studies that are going on now, over time, we'll get a good feeling for what might happen in certain habitats. So the habitats in Bali are vastly different from the habitats in southern India where I saw them. I mean, these dogs who I've run into in Kenya, they're wonderful people. I mean, could they use a little vet care? Yeah, they probably could, but no one's doing dental implants on dogs. I mean, in any kind of high quantity. These dogs do well. Do they fight sometimes? Yeah, they fight sometimes, and so do regular, if home dogs. So that's why I want to be the fly on the wall.
We've got another question here from Eagle, which takes us off in a completely different direction. He asks, are the dogs different from other animals that accompany humans in our lives? So we've got lots of animals in our lives, but are dogs different? And if so, how?
You want to take that first, or you want me to?
Go. It's a good question.
Yeah, is it? It is a good question, and especially if you go down the path of, we could do a thought experiment about cats. Cats' world. How would cats do in a world without humans, or rabbits, or you could think of all the forces, animals who live in close relationship with us. And I think there are a lot of things that are unique about dogs. One thing is the level of friendliness that they have with us, which you don't see quite as obviously on display in cats. And dogs are so, as Mark said in response to one of the questions, I think about diet, dogs are remarkably behaviorally flexible. So perhaps more so than almost any animal, including us. Yeah. And so I would say that's a unique thing about dogs, and probably gives dogs a uniquely good opportunity to survive without us in a post-human future, if there is one. Yep. But I think any animal could do fine without us, and all of them might do better without us in many respects.
Yeah. What was the first thing you said? I was looking up the text in our book to see something we wrote, but you made the first point you made about survival.
Oh, friendliness. It was about the hyper-sociability of dogs. As a kind of unique feature of who they are.
Yeah. I mean, Yeah, that might.
Their interest in being our friends.
Oh, I know what it was. So I actually did an interview with Jonathan Lozos, who wrote a great book called The Cat's Meow, but it's got a different title in the UK. We actually wrote an essay about this together last month. There's no evidence that dogs would do better than cats, or mainly, yeah, or maybe it would be very similar, because one of the myths about cats is that they're asocial, and they're not. Um, and I can send you that link if anybody's interested. But what's fascinating, because Jonathan's really a cat expert, on top of being one of the world's leading evolutionary biologists. And I read his book. I mean, it was the most amazing learning experience I've ever had. But years ago, the ethologists who have studied cats, there was a German ethologist called Paul Lehausen. He made the point that cats are social. They pee, that's part of spacing out behavior, which is social. They can live in large groups. So maybe we could, I mean, one of the things Jonathan and I talked about, but we didn't write about, was, maybe we could get more information on how dogs might do by looking at cats who are on their own, because there's a lot of free-ranging cats on their own. Unfortunately, people like to kill them, but well, but anyway, yeah, the hypersociality, sociality, or social nature of dogs could really pay off for bonding with other animals when they're on their own. Yeah.
Can I ask you another question about that hypersociability of dogs? Because anybody who has dogs knows that they have best friends. That there are some dogs that they meet that they are really excited to see again, and others that they really don't like. That sometimes if you tell them the name of their best friend, they get excited before they meet them. And I read once about a city where homed dogs went outside, had free ranging, like we used to when I was a kid. We used to just open the door and let the dogs out. And they used to. I read that they actually form packs, and that they go and they meet the same friends again each time.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? Is that what happens?
Yeah, there's been great studies in Italy about that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a great movie, a film that a friend of mine made about dog packs. And I have to remember where. I'm not quite remembering the city, where they meet up regularly. They travel together. They hang out together. Sometimes some go home. Some stay on their own. Next morning at 6 o'clock, they rendezvous again. And the groups I saw in India especially, would hang out in front of this fancy hotel. They got handouts and all that. And over the course of 2 weeks, I mean, I would consider myself honored, and I really mean it. I became their friend. They walked over, and they, in their brain was going, there's that guy that speaks Hindi. He, blah, 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 blah. He's our friend. And I would bring them out. It was all vegan food, because the hotel had a very vegan bar. They loved it. So yes, they do.
You were an honorary pack member.
I felt, well, not only me, it was called the Asia for Animals meeting, and a bunch of us went out there, and it was one of the most thrilling parts of the meeting. Was we'd come out, and all the dogs would run up to us and just hang out with us regularly. But related to your question, some went to a home, some didn't. But at 6 o'clock in the morning, it was guaranteed you'd have basically the same social group of 8 or 10 dogs.
Yeah. How did the different packs get on with each other in the city? Did they fight, ignore each other, or?
Nobody's really studied that, but the group in Italy the different groups would do okay. In Turkey, they actually do quite fine. In Turkey, free-ranging dogs are protected. You can't harm them. In India, during COVID, it became a mandate of the government that people, it was an exempted activity. You could go, and you didn't have to feed them, but feeding them was allowed. Your question is a great one. And I'm actually taping notes on this. I'm going to send it off to people, because Marco Adam might have data on that from Bali, where they have packs in different. I don't know. I don't remember what the capital of Bali is, but they might have different groups. But the ones in India, when wolves and coyotes form groups and don't form groups, it's called fusion and fission. They're kind of a fusion fission society. And, who knows? But I watch these animals in China come together, hang out, have a Chinese meal. No, I'm being facetious there, and then go home and come back the next day.
I love that. I just love the thought of that.
No, I do too. And so they needed dental care, a lot of them. I mean, I do agree that one of the things they don't get might be vet care for mange and their teeth. But in terms of their personalities and temperaments, they do pretty damn well.
The next question is actually more, is about dogs' character. So I'll go on to that. It's from Vera, who asks, how was the dog's character formed? Is it caused by a dog's genetic parents or the human family they live with?
Both and. Yeah, I mean, it's so complicated. And, I live with a dog, Bella, who's a rescue from what was probably a pretty difficult first year of life. We don't really know very many details other than that she was abandoned on the street, and probably was either kept in a garage or some kind of kennel, because she just didn't even really know how to navigate her environment, had never been in snow, or didn't seem to know what to do with a body of water. And she's also what if you were a trainer, you would call a reactive dog. She doesn't like people very much. And, there's always a question in our mind, is it from her experiences in the first year of life that she's this way, or is it just that she's this way? And it's impossible to answer. I think do you want to jump in?
No, when you finish, because I have a good story that relates to that question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complicated mix of things, but I do think that one thing that is important for us to think about with companion dogs is that it matters. Even what happens to them when they're in the womb matters to how they grow and develop as individuals, and that trauma can start very early and can have a lasting impact on how the brain develops and how the personality or character of the dog develops. And so, as much as we can protect dogs from early trauma, whether it's in utero or as puppies, or even there's some research on the trauma experienced by mothers being carried down behaviorally to pups. I think it's worth taking a kind of a broad view of dog care as starting very, very early.
Yeah, I mean, so when we studied wild coyotes, but I've also seen this in wild wolves in Yellowstone, when the pups would emerge from the same hole in the ground, same parents, same micro environment, at 21 days, give or take, you'd have shy, bold, and just tremendously obnoxious pups who you wanted them to survive, but you hoped you never had to be around them. No, but seriously, so it's related to your question, and I've seen this in baby wolves in Yellowstone, and also in captivity. Who knows what was going on? But these were the same litter mates. And when I used to go to one of the local dog parks a lot, I came down there and there were two pups. They were brothers who had been abandoned by a road in by roadside in New Mexico. And guy went down there and adopted them. And they were given, he said 8 weeks, maybe they were between 8 and 12 weeks. They were like black and white. One was gregarious. It took 6 months for him to even become a close friend of the human who rescued him. but I saw the process because I was going there a lot because that's what I get paid to do. And no, seriously. So, you know, it's sort of like the nature nurture question. And these examples really touched me because and it was repeated. We had a lot of litters of pups who we observed over 8.5 years in the wild, but they'd go from 0 to 180, in terms of personality and temperament. And they all had the same mommy and daddy, you know. One of the interesting things was how the personality differences played out over time as they matured and had their own babies. And there was some indication that perhaps, and I want to stress this because these data are impossible to collect in the wild, that it's possible the more socially gregarious did better, but we really don't know. So there's about 25 dissertations, and maybe Jessica's daughter, who's getting her PhD, can do another PhD thesis on this. But it's a great question because we don't know how this will play out when we're not around. We definitely affect the development. You think of puppies who were abused, they're hit, they're slapped, or even other dogs who go to people who use shock collars or prong collars, and treat them really negatively during training. It's got long-term effects on their behavior, as it would on us. But I love the question because, once again, it's another reason why I'd like to be around to see how these might play out without us. Would there be the stabilizing selection for a certain, if you will, temperament of personality? My feeling is no, because these are wild coyotes who never really were affected by humans, and they went all over the place at 3 weeks of age.
You could have been talking about humans. Everything you said could have been about humans too, couldn't it?
They don't particularly interest me. So.
Yeah.
But these, boy, I mean, these are wonderful. These are wonderful questions. I mean, they're the questions that in the end, we had to leave open-ended, in a sense, except for the failure of these anatomically deformed dogs to survive, because they would definitely just not make it.
The next question then comes from our cat. Cat likes jam. And she asks, how does one test theory of mind in dogs or in other animals? Because you spoke about it, but how do you test it?
Well, I mean, people do lab studies on it. They'll put things under a cup. I mean, they'll put objects under a cup, or they'll have people doing something, and then is there any evidence that the dogs know, if you will, what the person is thinking or doing? And I mean, and Jessica can correct me. I think the captive studies are interesting, but they don't really tell me much because you got to watch animals, dogs who can do these things. I mean, one of the things I was going to say before, the problem with a lot of these captive studies is they're so highly controlled. The dogs don't have the ability to express their full behavioral repertoire. And they'll say, well, your studies of free-ranging dogs are uncontrolled, so you don't really know what's going on. I lean to the, if you will, allowing dogs to be dogs. So I watch dogs and I film them, and I have in the past, and I see evidence that they do know what another dog is thinking or feeling. Do I know that? No, but I believe they do. So the highly controlled studies, and I've partaken in some of them. Like I said before, the science is good. The research is doing this. The work is bright. The data are sound, but I don't think they tell you much about who dogs are when they're able to freely express their dogness.
Got just a few more questions left. Vera
Just say something.
Vera asks,
yeah,
did you want to say something?
I would just add that, our capacity to study theory of mind or self-awareness or whatnot in other animals is limited by our species experience. And we can only ask questions that we have the imagination to come up with. And our sensory experience of the world is so different from that of other animals that I think we have to recognize the limits of human cognition in trying to think about what other animals have or don't have in terms of these capacities. And, one of the famous tests to study self-recognition, the mirror test, is really, there's been a lot of debate about it because it's really focused around visual perception, and the way humans understand ourselves as us versus not us. And I think there are just realms of sensory experience that are beyond us and that we're not even capable of asking questions about because they're so different. So
I mean, what Jessica's saying is so true because we're using dogs, but it could be other animals. They communicate using sounds we can't hear, odors, probably thank goodness we can't detect, and facial expression. So it's vision, audition, and olfaction, and they form these really complicated signals we call composite signals that we just can't decipher. I mean, we might be able to when we look at films, and I've done enough of that to drive me crazy. But Jessica's right. I mean, they communicate so vastly differently from us that we use their behavior as the template for, I mean, I do that for when they play or when they fight, or you watch certain patterns of social interaction forming. They know what's going on. Can we detect it? I don't know. I mean, I think I can. I'm pretty good at watching dogs and wolves and coyotes. But for researchers to say dogs do not have a theory of mind is just ridiculous. A lot of it comes from people who are primatal-centric. So there's people out there who study great apes and say only great apes do this, not even other non-human primates, like, say, monkeys, okay? Which is just absurd. And so...
Is that sort of like, if you're not doing it like us, you're not doing it at all?
Well, yeah, right. But they're also speciesist because they think there's humans, great apes, and all other animals. And one of the things I'm really glad about, and I could say it publicly, is one of the leading primatologists, Frans de Waal, he and I had a long talk years ago, and I just really said, you got to factor in the carnivores. I mean, you really do. What we know about dogs, and he's done that. And the fact of the matter is, if you read some of the papers now on great ape cognition or emotions and sentience, you could substitute, instead of gorilla, chimpanzee, or bonobo, you could substitute dog, wolf, coyote, and maybe even mice, because we know that mice display empathy. There's been very detailed studies of that. So I think, what we really need to do in the big picture is just open ourselves up to the fact that a lot of animals can do things about which we might never have full disclosure. But it would be ridiculous to think that social dogs and other social animals don't have a theory of mind. That they can't anticipate what's going to happen based on their beliefs. Like, I believe that you believe something, and philosophers have beaten it to death, and most of them have never watched an animal. Sorry, and I really mean it. That's where Jessica's very different, and some of the philosophers with whom I've worked, is they actually watch the animals. They don't go into the ivory tower and bury themselves in books and jargon. And then I'll say I've actually said to some dog researchers with whom I'm friendly and still friendly, have you ever gone to a dog park? Have you ever watched free-ranging dogs? No. Well, get out there and watch them, because Marco Ada is very different. But get out there and watch them because when you see them functioning in their, quote, normal environment, it's not that long ago that dogs were free-ranging, as becoming dogs from wolves. I mean, biologically, geologically, go watch them. So my feeling very strongly is that the bottom line, when you boil it all down, is a lot of people are saying that a lot of dog behavior is genetic. It's innate. It's inborn. Well, some is and some isn't. Some's not. But the fact of the matter is, when you watch them in their natural environment where they can be dogs, if you were watching chimpanzees, you would say they have a theory of mind. If you were watching elephants, you would say that. oh, but not dogs. I actually had somebody years ago tell me that studying dogs was a waste of time because they were human, they're artifacts, because they were created because we did create dogs ultimately in terms of artificial selection. I mean, it was the dumbest thing I've ever. He's not alive anymore, so if he's not, but I mean, it was the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. We're learning so much about the behavior of other non-human animals by studying dogs.
I was just a couple more questions actually, because I don't think we've got time for very much more. This is the question everybody asks when they watch their own dog lying there with its paws going like this when it's asleep. Vera asks, how can you know this? What do dogs see in their dreams? Are there any scientific work on it?
There's a really interesting book that came out in the last year, I think, called, is it called How Animals Dream? Do you remember the exact title?
Yeah.
And he is a philosopher, I'm sorry to say, Mark. But
I know him very well, actually.
Yeah. It's a really interesting book about the dream life of animals, and it isn't do animals dream, it's how do animals dream. And it's we always make jokes about your dog's chasing rabbits, and that there may actually be some truth to that, that they're replaying activities that they are hopefully they're getting to do in real life, but or that are instinctually really motivated to do. And I mean, it's impossible to know, but they're definitely dreaming, and it's probably pretty interesting stuff. Hopefully good dreams.
But there's also great studies on mice when they'll put surface electrodes on their when they run through a maze, and they'll get a certain EEG. And then when they monitor the mice at night, when they're sleeping in their little nests, probably cramped up in some crappy lab, they get the same EEG pattern. So the people who did that they're practicing, and it's called memory consolidation. I mean, people always ask me, and I actually had an entry in my book about it. Dogs can have nightmares. Maybe they're chasing, people say they're chasing a deer. Maybe they're chasing their best friend. Maybe they're chasing a deer. Maybe they're having a nightmare. We all probably have lived with enough dogs. Sometimes they get up and they have a crappy day, just like we might have. Maybe they had a nightmare. Maybe the moving is that they're scared, but there is no doubt that they dream. And probably because dogs are mammals like mice, and they have the same basic brain structure and neurochemicals. But that's another if you will, behavior or capacity, if you will, that people used to say, no, animals don't dream. I mean, the stuff people used to say, and some people are saying today, literally, it's just dumb. Sorry. I mean, they're not paying attention to what we've known for so long.
It's as if they're determined that they're different from us. Well, we do all these things, so they don't, isn't it?
It's speciesism, right? It's to exclude them from these hierarchies, these pyramids, humans, all other animals, or humans separate from and above, great apes, and then all other animals. And it's a name, but some people feel good to think they're on top of the pyramid,
And it's what Kat said, isn't it? When we were during the break, when she said every single animal alive today is at the pinnacle of its evolution. We're no different. We're no different. We're all, yeah.
Well, I wasn't quite sure what she meant by the pinnacle of their evolution.
Well, so we're all in here in 2023, and this is where evolution's got us
currently. Yeah. But we're going to evolve. I mean, our brains are going to change somewhat.
Yeah.
Although we still have pretty much Paleolithic brains, I think, with AI, and I don't mean AI particularly, but all the all the devices we have, all the electronics and information processing, we will evolve. It's going to take a long time, of course. But right, we are where we are. This just sounds dumb for me to say. We are where wherever you go, there you are. That book. We are where we are now, and
I would also
evolution goes very slowly.
I would say, I'm not sure exactly what word to choose, but I might choose a different word than pinnacle, because that suggests that we've reached, like, evolution is moving towards some ultimate, like, it's better now than it used to be. It's more adaptive now. But I think there's this, it feeds into a misperception about dogs, which is that dogs who are, especially, I think people maybe in the United States especially tend to think this way. That the way we do things is what dogs have evolved for. Like, we're doing pet keeping, dog keeping, better than ever before in the past, and dogs have evolved for the purpose of being our loyal companions. And the popularity of this movie called A Dog's Purpose, which is about a dog whose sole purpose in life is to be one kind of companion after another, and then finally the perfect kind of companion to the perfect person. And that's not, I think that's not fair to dogs, because as we try to make clear in the book, dogs who live as free roaming individuals have lives that are just as interesting and valuable to them as dogs who live as pets. And being a pet isn't necessarily a more dog-like thing to do, a more perfect dog existence than living as a feral or free-ranging individual. So,
yeah, definitely.
I'm going to move on to the final question then, which is from Igor. I'm going to read out what he says. Apart from saying that it's going to be a fun final question, what will be the ultimate post-apocalyptic animal? And he says, for example, cows aren't really fighters and don't look like they'll dominate, but we made an awful lot of them.
Oh, that is a good question.
Yeah, but
I mean, I would venture to say dogs.
Yeah, I'm having what I'm having trouble figuring is what they mean. I mean, dogs are so diverse and adaptable now that they definitely have the genetic and cognitive and emotional intelligence capacities to make it. So possibly dogs.
They live everywhere, don't they, dogs? Can they survive almost anywhere?
Yeah, there's no dogs inherent to Antarctica, but I was in Antarctica and I met the descendants of the original dogs who went on Bird's expedition. They're New Zealand dogs. They do great down there.
Do you know? I'm going to take that dogs will be the ultimate post-apocalyptic animal, and I don't mind if you haven't actually said that. I'm going to take it anyway because I quite like it.
I like it too.
I do too. Yes.
And that's a good place to end.
It is, and I've absolutely loved chatting with you, and I've also learned an awful lot, and I hope everybody else has who's been listening. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, and thank you once again to Jessica and Mark for a brilliant talk and the most fun Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you
all. Thanks everybody for your questions. They were really, really good questions.
Very, very wide ranging. Thank you.
Thank you.